Chapter 1. Meet the Colonists. Coming to Pennsylvania on a pleasant summer day in 1750, a ship carrying 400 Germans arrived at the docks in Philadelphia. These newcomers were about to begin their lives in a new place. Even 100 years earlier, the arrival of 400 immigrants was not big news. Back then, many people wanted to start a new life in the English colony. At the time, there were 5 English colonies in North America. By 1750, there were 13 English colonies on the east coast of what became the United States. All of them were strong and growing. Almost every week, a ship arrived with more immigrants. The population of the colonies had already passed 1 million and was quickly climbing toward 2 million. Settlements had spread from the Atlantic Ocean to as far west as the Appalachian Mountains. I'm looking at the picture of the boats and the people by the docks on page 3. It says, immigrants by the hundreds arrived in the American colonies in the 1700s. Now I'm on page 4. Why had so many people come to the British colonies in North America? Why were still so many coming in 1750? The answer is simply opportunity. The opportunity to own land of their own, the opportunity to work in growing towns and cities, the opportunity to worship as they pleased, the opportunity to escape the past and start a new life. So remember, those are the reasons we talked about why people wanted to start life in the new colonies. They wanted new towns and cities, they wanted to work, they wanted to own their own land, they wanted their freedom of religion, and they wanted to start a new life in a new place. Who were these colonists? Where were they from? They were mainly ordinary people, farmers and people from small towns. Most colonists were from England, but a large number, almost a third, came from Germany. Many others came from Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Sweden, and the Netherlands. So these colonists that we're talking about all came from Europe, right across us here in New York, across the Atlantic Ocean. Not all those who migrated to the colonies traveled willingly. So now we're talking about all the immigrants or the colonists who came over from Europe came because they wanted to come. Now they're talking about immigrants who have traveled against their will. They didn't come here because they wanted to start a new life. They came here because they were forced to. It says about 1 in 5 persons was enslaved, having been forcefully removed from his or her home in Africa. Most eventually found themselves in the South, but there were enslaved people in the North too. Almost none of the people who came from Africa were free. So I want to pause there for a minute, because they're talking about the people in the colonies. So you have the people who moved here because they wanted to start a new life, those colonists in the northern, middle, and southern colonies. Those are the people from Ireland, Germany, Great Britain, or England at the time. And now they're talking about people coming over from Africa, another continent, and they were brought here at the same time, but they were brought here because they had to. They had to come, they were put to work here. So we have 2 different types of people coming to the same place for 2 different reasons. One wanted to start a new life. These other people were going to help them and work for free in helping those people start a new life. So now I'm on page 4, Life in the Colonies. More than 9 out of 10 colonial families lived on farms. They farmed their land by themselves. Every member of the family had a job to do. As a result, they produced nearly everything they needed to survive. They raised their own food, they made their own clothes and their own tools, they made their own furniture. Most of them even built the houses they lived in. When the weather and the harvest were good, farmers sometimes had enough food left over to sell. I'm looking at the picture on page 5. It says colonists made almost everything they needed for themselves. In the mid-1700s, there were still only 4 or 5 cities in all of the colonies, and just a handful of towns. These cities were small by today's standards, but they were growing quickly. In just a few short years, Philadelphia would become the 2nd largest city in the whole British Empire, next to London, England. So they're saying it's growing rapidly. A lot of people want to come here, and they want to come here now. Well, at the time. What sparked this growth of towns and cities? Trade within the colonies and within the other countries was a driving factor. So all these people wanted to come here because they wanted to trade. From the docks in the cities on the East Coast, merchants sent lumber, fur, salted fish, flour, rice, indigo, and tobacco to many parts of the world. To those docks, ships returned with glass, paint, tea, wine, and other goods the colonists needed or wanted. So some of the things they sent out from the colonies, or the goods, were flour, rice, tobacco, and some of the goods that were traded that came back from other parts of the world were glass, paint, tea. Now I'm on page 6. Trade also meant jobs. Men loaded and unloaded ships. They built boats. They made sails, rope, and barrels for shipping goods. The cities and towns offered other kinds of work too. Men and women ran stores. Men and some women ran stores and shops. This tells me that maybe men and women had different roles at this time. Skilled workers baked bread and made pots and pans. Others printed newspapers or made fine shoes and clothes for other city dwellers. This subheading says staying apart and coming together. When immigrants arrived in the colonies, they preferred to settle near people who were from the same country. This made them feel more comfortable in a strange new land. So they're saying the people who came over from Ireland wanted to settle near the other people who came over from Ireland. Or the people who came from England wanted to settle near the people who came from England. They could speak their own language and follow their own traditional ways of life. They wore the same kinds of clothing they had worn in their homeland and built the same kinds of houses. In time, however, something interesting and important happened. Immigrant groups began to borrow ideas and customs from each other. For example, consider the log cabin. Swedes, or people from Sweden, helped build log cabins in their homeland. In the colonies, they found plenty of trees that could be used to build homes. A log cabin was easy to build. 2 strong settlers with axes could build one in a couple of weeks. Other groups that came to North America with their own ideas of how to build a house. Other groups came to North America with their own ideas of how to build a house. Meaning they weren't picturing a log cabin, they were picturing what had been built in their countries. So, when they saw the log cabins built by Swedish settlers, they realized that these homes were perfect for life on the frontier. It's like the new area where there's wilderness, because no one had ever claimed the land there before. So if you see in the picture on the next page, they have to cut down logs in order to build the houses, because no one's ever lived there before. Soon, settlers from many different countries built log cabins like the ones built from Swedes. A log cabin could make a snug home for a frontier family. This borrowing of ideas and customs among immigrant groups even changed the way colonists spoke. Most colonists spoke with English, but English speakers began to borrow words from the other languages spoken in the colonies. They borrowed the words noodle and pretzel from German. They borrowed the words waffle and cookie and sleigh from the Dutch. The words pecan, moccasin, skunk, and squash came from the Native American languages. Remember, they were already living here before the colonists came over. Words such as yams, banjo, and tote came from African languages. The use of words borrowed from other languages created a new form of English that would eventually be called American English. Little by little, this new American English became the language of the children, grandchildren, and immigrants from other lands. I'm on page 8, called Better Roads. By the 1750s, the colonists were also being brought together by improved roads. These roads were not very good compared to our own. They were narrow, often muddy, and filled with tree stumps. Still, they were better than the roads of 50 or 100 years earlier. These roads made it easier to travel through the colonies. Easier travel led to increased trade among the colonies. If people are able to trade more, they're able to get goods and make the money, which is why they started a new life here. Some people. Better roads also improved communications by speeding up the exchange of information. Remember, they didn't have iPhones back then. In the mid-1750s, mail delivery between Philadelphia and Boston increased to once a week instead of every 2 weeks. So back then, the mail only came every 2 weeks. That was the only way you could get your information out. That meant the newspapers printed in cities could be delivered to colonists in the countryside more easily. Colonists could now read the same news and stay informed about the same things. In all these ways, colonists of many different backgrounds were starting to come together. They were beginning, just beginning, of course, to have more things in common. This coming together soon became very important. And if you look on page 9, they have a map of all the different colonies, all 13. There's the northern, the northern are also the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and then the southern colonies. I just want to recap what we read. This was all about meeting the colonists, or the people on the land, or the people who came here, okay? They were saying this was happening in the 1750s. Many people came over for the reasons that we've already talked about in social studies. They wanted a new life, new opportunities for growing cities and towns. They wanted to own their own land. They wanted freedom of religion. They wanted to escape their old past life in their old country, which may not have been so good, and start a new life. Okay, all these colonists or settlers or immigrants, all those different words we call them, came, the ones we're talking about in this time period, the 13 colonies, came from Europe. Okay, that's England, Germany, Scotland, Ireland. If you've heard of Wales, Sweden, and the Netherlands, those are also other countries around today. But back then, they were around before the United States, and some of the people living there at those times didn't like the life there. So they started to come over to the 13 colonies, or where we live now, because it wasn't yet a country, and they wanted to start to make it a better life. They talked about life in the colonies. It said 9 out of 10 people lived on farms. So there weren't so many cities around back then. Every family member had a job to do. It seemed like life was really hardworking back then. Everyone was trading. They had to collect all these goods. People had jobs. People sent around news. Communication also, they mentioned at the end, wasn't as readily available as it is now today. We also learned at one point, when people came over to the colonies, these immigrants, they wanted to settle with the same people from their own country. So if you realize that, now today we have different neighborhoods of New York City called like Little Italy or Chinatown. Okay, Chinatown happened a little bit later, but that's because everyone who came over from China or everyone who came over from Italy wanted to live in the same area. Okay. They talked about making log cabins because it was a lot of forest over here when people started a new life. So people borrowed ideas from other customs and traditions. So people who weren't Swedish still made log homes, even though the Swedish were the original people to make log homes. And they also talked about better roads. They weren't great back then, but things had started to improve. The quality of roads, they were muddy, they weren't paved yet. And also communication. News didn't get around as quick. So life was a little bit slower back then. People were also very hardworking. And also they were really motivated to come here and start that new life. So if you have any questions, post a comment below. I'm curious to see what you took away from this article and what you think about the colonists. What information you still need to know. Anything. Let me know.